acres of Tovangar, which consists of the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. It's important, especially for a conservation organization such as ORCA, to recognize the indigenous communities in the area and understand and acknowledge their role in the preservation of the region's land and waterways. So this quarter, ORCA's theme has been ocean acidification. As we continue to burn fossil fuels for energy, the oceans have begun to acidify with more carbon dioxide being pumped into the air. The purpose of this panel is to learn about how the experiences and work of our three speakers, Dr. Jeana Drake, Dr. Libby Jewett, and Dr. Sabine, relate to ocean acidification. Throughout this panel, we also plan to discuss the future of ocean acidification research, education, and policy. So each of our speakers will give a 10-minute presentation. After each presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session during which we will have the opportunity to ask each of them questions. And then finally, after our third presentation and Q&A session, we'll have an open forum for the audience and speakers to ask additional questions. So now let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Jeana Drake is currently at UCLA as an assistant project scientist while also conducting research as a Zuckerman STEM postdoctoral fellow at the University of Haifa in Israel. She also occasionally serves as a lecturer at UCLA in the EEB and Earth, Planetary Space Sciences, and the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences departments. She has studied and worked in coastal resource conservation with harmful algal blooms, seagrass biogeochemistry, and the mechanisms and evolution of coral calcification over the past 17 years. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Drake. Dr. Drake, you should be able to share your screen and start your presentation.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you, Kate. Let's see. Oh, sorry. So Marcus, when you talked about editing, me driving around with my computer can be one of those first edits. Okay, can everyone see the whole slide and nothing but the slide? Great, thank you. And can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. As I mentioned before, I have a Zoom first grader, and so if I start getting glitchy, somebody can just unmute themselves and let me know, and I'll turn off my camera. So thank you to the ORCA organizers for including me on the panel today. I'm very excited to hear what the other two panelists have to say and what your group has been discussing about ocean acidification this quarter. I'm going to give a talk about some of my research on the evolution and biomolecular mechanisms of calcification in marine organisms. It's going to be very superficial overview. And when I say biomolecular mechanisms, I mostly mean proteins. Okay, with Kate's permission, I'll go a little bit longer because I wanted to front end my presentation with a quick overview of ocean acidification and its impacts on calcification, just in case there are some people who are joining the panel discussion today, who aren't familiar with ocean acidification or calcification. So carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere can dissolve into the ocean where it becomes dissolved carbon dioxide. Unlike gases like nitrogen or N2 and oxygen gas O2 that can also dissolve into solution and that don't react with water, carbon dioxide, when it's dissolved in water, can react with a water molecule to form carbonic acid, which almost immediately dissociates into a proton, or more correctly, a hydronium ion, and bicarbonate, or HCO3 minus, excuse me. And then this bicarbonate doesn't always, but can dissociate into another proton, or more correctly, hydronium ion, and carbonate, or CO3 2 minus. And this addition of protons or hydronium ions to the water increases their concentration, and by mathematics, decreases the pH and makes the water more acidic. Okay, so then how does this impact calcification? Well, when we think about calcification, to the most simple terms, we usually think about this carbonate because it has this 2 minus charge. And you can take a calcium with a 2+ charge, react it with a carbonate with a 2- charge, and form calcium carbonate. And this is the simple inorganic consideration of calcium carbonate formation. Okay. So we can relate the different dissolved inorganic carbon species, or your dissolved CO2, your bicarbonate, and your carbonate. We can relate their relative concentration to pH on something like this Bjerrum plot. So on the y-axis, you have from 0 to 1, or so this would be 100% of that given carbonate species. And then on the x-axis, we have the pH going from low pH or high hydrogen ion concentration to high pH or low hydrogen ion concentration. So at very low pHs, nearly 100% of the dissolved inorganic carbon species are as dissolved CO2 gas. And at very high pH, 100% of the dissolved inorganic carbon species are as carbonate, the CO3 2-. Modern seawater pH here is on the dotted line at about 8.1, 8.2. And so at modern seawater pH, about 85% of the dissolved inorganic carbon is as bicarbonate, and a much smaller proportion, or about 15%, is as carbonate. And if we're thinking about very simple calcium carbonate formation, this is the one we would be considering. And my mouse is gone somewhere. And so as you decrease ocean pH or move this dotted line to the left, you get a lower and lower relative abundance of carbonate. Okay, so if we have less of this carbonate that would react with calcium to form calcium carbonate, how does this impact marine organisms? Well, we can use an example. This is a pteropod. This is a gastropod mollusk. It makes a single shell. Most of them are translucent, and the shell is made of calcium carbonate. As a mollusk, it has a foot, and the foot is modified into these 2 wings. And so to move through the water, it moves these wings and kind of looks like it's flying. So that's where it gets its common name, the sea butterfly. Pteropods are very abundant over continental shelves, and they eat plankton, phytoplankton, and they're very, very small, usually less than 1 centimeter. But even though they're very small, because they can be so abundant, they can have a huge impact on salmon populations because they're great salmon food. Salmon will eat tons and tons of pteropods and then swim upstream to lay their eggs. So if you either eat salmon or think that bears getting really plump for the winter by eating salmon is a good thing, then we want to have pteropods. And so in this experiment that I'm showing here from 2005, pteropods were grown in artificial seawater that was modified to approximate the CO2 concentrations predicted for the end of the century, so 750 to 1,000 parts per million CO2. And after about a month and a half, the pteropod shells were very deformed. The pteropods were having a hard time making their shells. And in addition, there was active dissolution of the shell going on. And then, as I bet you can imagine, this would be very bad for the pteropod's survival and population. Okay, so what other organisms in the ocean make calcium carbonate? We can have photosynthetic organisms like coralline algae. So both red and green algae calcify. This here that I'm showing is crustose coralline algae. It encrusts over coral reefs and helps to hold together the reef structure as one large solid limestone. And I'm going to get evolutionary more complex as I go through some of these organisms. These are 2 single-celled organisms. They are protists. This is a foraminiferan, or sometimes called for short foram, as Libby mentioned earlier. It makes, where did my pointer go? It makes this calcium carbonate test that kind of looks like popcorn outside of its single cell, and so that the calcium carbonate is exposed to the seawater. And forams are non-photosynthetic. There are also protists that are photosynthetic that calcify. This is a coccolithophore. It makes these individual coccoliths, or calcium carbonate plates, inside of its cell and then pops them outside of the cell for protection. And so again, these calcium carbonate plates or coccoliths are in contact with seawater. Getting more complex, we can go into our multicellular organisms, animals that calcify. So some, not all, but some sponges calcify. They make calcium carbonate spicules inside their tissue, so somewhat protected from seawater. Many cnidarians calcify. I study stony corals, so they calcify extracellularly, but the calcium carbonate is somewhat separated from the seawater by the tissue layers. Soft corals calcify. They make calcium carbonate sclerites inside their tissues, so protected from seawater. And then some hydrozoans, such as lace corals shown here and fire corals, calcify, probably with roughly similar mechanisms to the stony corals. I already showed you mollusks. Single-shelled mollusks can calcify. You can also get your bivalves, clams, oysters, mussels that calcify. In this case, the calcium carbonate is slightly protected from contact with the ocean water by a thin cell layer, but parts of the shell can be exposed to seawater as well. Sea urchins calcify. They make calcium carbonate spines, these pointy things. They make a test that covers the body and is covered by a cell layer. The spines are not covered by a cell layer. And then they also make teeth that they use for scraping algae off of rocks as food. And the spines and the teeth are exposed to seawater. And then lastly, we have our most complex are vertebrates, such as fish. Fish, like you and I, make their bones of calcium phosphate, but they do make a calcium carbonate hard part. And since I like to pick on my former students, I wanted to have Jessie Patzlaff quickly unmute herself and tell you what is the calcium carbonate hard part that fish make.
Sure. So the calcium carbonate hard part that fish make is actually the otolith, which is their ear bone, and it's basically in the skull underneath the brain. And it helps with hearing and balance and movement sensing, pretty much.
Thank you, Jessie. So all of these organisms that make calcium carbonate parts of their body can be impacted by ocean acidification, but it's not just a simple, what you'd consider to be problematic for inorganic calcium carbonate precipitation. These organisms do what's called biomineralization. So they use biomolecules and greatly modify the calcifying environment to be able to calcify, so that some simple assumptions about what ocean acidification can do to calcification may not always be correct. So I study stony corals, and specifically I study the proteins that stony corals secrete into the calcifying space and that end up retained in the skeleton. So this is a cross-section of a stony coral. You have the tentacles for feeding and defense. And stony corals are very simple. They're 4 cell layers, 2 layers closest to the water. So here you have the overlying seawater, and then there's 2 cell layers closest to the skeleton, and the ectodermal layer closest to the skeleton is called the calicoblastic ectoderm. So this is an artist rendering of a cross-section. Here's an actual cross-section of stony coral tissue where we have where the seawater would have been when the organism was alive. The 2 cell layers closest to the seawater, and then the 2 cell layers closest to the skeleton. So this is where the skeleton would have been. And this cell layer here is the calicoblastic ectoderm. And in this study from quite a few years ago now, the researchers took the stony coral skeleton, they dissolved away the calcium carbonate, they took the proteins and injected them into a bunny to have the bunny make antibodies. And then they applied the antibody plus a fluorescent reporter to this. So this is the same cross-section as the light micrograph here. It's just now it's able to detect fluorescence. And where you see lighted up cell layer is where the antibody against the skeletal proteins bound to cells that were making those proteins in the tissue. So no surprise really that the cell layer that's closest to the skeleton is making these skeletal proteins. Those antibodies were raised against the whole complex of skeletal proteins from corals. You can also do these antibody studies with individual proteins. And in this case, in this second study down here, we still have the same general cross-section of a coral. The blue is the cells dyed with a fluorescent, nuclei dyed with a fluorescent dye. This would be the cell layer that's closest to the skeleton. Here's where the skeleton would have been in black. And here is the red fluorescent reporter of an antibody to a bicarbonate transporter. So bicarbonate transporters span the cell membrane. And in this case, it could take bicarbonate from inside the cell and export it out to the site of calcification between the tissue layer and the skeleton. And I wanted to bring up this protein in particular because I mentioned at the beginning that we usually consider carbonate as the dissolved inorganic carbon species of interest when we think about calcification, but there's biological and geochemical evidence that bicarbonate could also be directly involved in calcification, at least in corals. I next wanted to bring up some evolution of coral skeletal genes. So this is a very busy figure. Mostly ignore all of this up here. All of these here are species names for cnidarians, and all of the ones about here are stony corals. And then as you go to the left in species names, you're getting organisms that are more and more distant from cnidarians all the way back to sponges. Here, the rows are individual genes that code for proteins that we know are embedded in stony coral skeleton. And anywhere where there's the dark blue or the green is where we find the gene that codes for a protein that we find in stony coral skeleton, where we find that gene in that individual species. So each column is a species and each row is a gene. Where there's light blue, that's where we find a similar protein in a completely different species where we've never tested for the presence of those skeletal proteins. And what this image is meant to show is that about half the genes that code for stony coral skeletal proteins are found in taxa that are very, very distantly related to stony coral. So about half of the molecular machinery for stony coral calcification has an ancestral origin, whereas the other half, here are these genes that have a lot of pink, are novel genes to cnidarians. So to wrap up, we have a lot of genetic information. There's probably over 20 coral genomes that are now sequenced. We have a lot of genetic information. We can do transcriptomic studies, see which genes are transcribed from the DNA starting material. And we can also study the individual proteins, both what they do and how abundant they are under different experimental conditions. People have been moving on from the simple ocean acidification experiments of previous decade or so, where we just tested increased CO2 concentration in the water. And we can add in to the matrix things like thermal stress. So what happens when you have both ocean acidification and thermal stress? We can look at different developmental stages. So to pick on a second student, I wanted to ask Marcus, can you tell me about this image here in the center in terms of developmental stages?
Yeah, of course. So in the middle, when we're talking about different developmental stages, we're mainly talking about how there's a difference between coral larvae and then the actual polyp when it's settled in an adult. And so in the very first image, that's where it says 1, 2, and 3. This is mainly talking about larval development. 1 is kind of talking about the long elongated larvae when it first comes out, and this slowly kind of compresses until it becomes that pumpkin shape you see in number 2. And then lastly, when it starts to calcify is when it's called spat. So that's when it settles. And that's the number 3 image right there.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And so we can look at some of the genetic responses across the different developmental stages and as we apply some of these stressors. And then we can also look at generational effects. So now that we have some of the background information that was done over the last 20 years or so, we can combine multiple stressors and multiple developmental stages and generations to try to understand why are we seeing some of the species differences in calcification. So in the case of this coral that was grown at increasing CO2 concentration, its calcification rate did not decrease with increased CO2, but a different species grown at increasing CO2, its calcification rate did decrease. And so we're hoping to understand some of those species differences. And with that, I will release the floor.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was super informative, and I loved being able to see all the work that you do. I will now open it up to questions. So if you have any questions for Jeana, feel free to write them in the chat, and then I can read them out. While people are thinking of their questions, I have a few for you. First of all, I was just wondering, in general, what made you want to enter research in the oceanic sciences and specifically into what you're looking at now with corals?
Sure. So I'm from Iowa and I didn't see the ocean until I was 14. And once I was in, they couldn't get me out until they were saying, my parents were saying, the car is leaving to drive back to Iowa. Get in the car or you're staying in South Carolina. It's the biggest habitat on Earth. like at least at Earth's surface. And there's just so many great questions that can be answered, and so much to study, so many wonderful organisms. I've worked all the way from cyanobacteria up to fish, and there's just so many interesting things in the ocean.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any other questions, you can ask them in the chat. I have more too, so I will gladly take over the Q&A. Marcus told me, Jeana, that you teach a little bit. I think he said in middle school and high schools, as well as being a lecturer in college. I was wondering, just in general, what your thoughts are on access to education in marine and environmental sciences, and how you think that the education regarding these sciences is changing, and also how we can promote, how institutions like UCLA can promote better access to this type of education.
Sure. I can tell you marine science education has gotten a lot better since I was in K through 12. So in California, we have the next generation science standards. And so the state has asked teachers to put together kind of like packets of activities that they can do with students to help understand marine science. There are some courses at the high school level where for every segment within, it's the advanced, the advanced environmental science course at the usually juniors, sophomores, juniors, and seniors take it. Where every segment within the course, they consider anthropogenic impacts on whatever they're discussing. I should mention that the California Science Standards go from K through 12. So there are actually activities for 4th and 5th graders, although my daughter's 1st grade teacher said she didn't know of any that were specifically targeting marine sciences for 1st graders, but they don't really even know what the difference between a solid and a liquid and a gas is. So that's okay. Los Angeles Unified School District is the 2nd largest public school district in the country, and they have been making a strong push to have marine science in and environmental science and understanding human impacts on the environment in classes. Many teachers are trying to do some outreach activities to get students involved outside of the classroom, or to do hands-on experiments for senior projects. So in high schools in Los Angeles, at the end of every year, students have to present how they've done some outside activities to improve their education to prepare them for college. So it's like a year-end review. And so last year I was on one of the review panels, and there were a lot of students getting, they were doing DNA barcoding work out in the Channel Islands. I have some students that have been involved in some of my proteomics work, but a lot of that has been not institutionalized. It's been people like maybe Chris or Libby do this, reaching out to their local high school and seeing how they can interact. Some of it has been a little bit ad hoc. There's currently a push with the Biocom Institute, which kind of tries to link life sciences and industry with K through 12 schools in Southern California, trying to get some push from industry to start, sending out those tendrils to try to get involved with schools, even if it's not at a super organized level, even if it's just one researcher at some biotech company reaching out to a school.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that lengthy answer. That was super informative. No, I didn't mean lengthy in a bad way though. It was nice, sorry. So I think there's another question in the chat from Nikita. Nikita has asked, with the multiple stressors approach, have you seen any surprising interactions between stressors, like antagonistic interactions rather than synergistic interactions?
Let's see. I can tell you there's a recent study by a graduate student in the lab that I'm affiliated with at the University of Haifa, where she took corals from deeper reefs where there's still light. They're called mesophotic reefs. Corals from these mesophotic reefs, and brought them up to shallow, and then also took some shallow corals of the same species and took them down to the deep reefs. And these mesophotic reefs are potentially an important refugia for corals to kind of get away from thermal, or have a pool of corals that's getting away from some of the thermal stress at the shallower depths. And she found some very interesting differences related to the coral's ability to, or the symbiont's ability within the coral to utilize light or be protected from light, depending on whether it was a coral that originated in the deep and was brought up to the shallow or vice versa. As far as antagonistic versus synergistic, I mean, so I can tell you that coral cell cultures that are grown at 700 parts per million CO2 actually calcify more than corals grown at ambient CO2 at the cell culture level. And I don't have a good explanation for that at the moment, especially because the cells are calcifying into the medium, whereas in corals, they calcify separated from the seawater. But there are a lot of interesting biomolecular patterns that happen when you raise CO2 a little bit. I can tell you that the calcification increase goes away at very high CO2 concentrations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that we've reached the end of this Q&A session. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to raise your hand. But if not, then thank you so much, Jeana. I will introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Libby Jewett. She is the founding director of the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program. As a founding member of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Steering Committee, convened first in 2007, Dr. Jewett co-led NOAA-wide meetings of scientists and policymakers to conceive and develop NOAA's first comprehensive ocean acidification research plan. She chairs the Ocean Acidification Interagency Working Group, where she helped develop an ocean acidification strategic research plan for the nation. So I will now share Dr. Jewett's slides, and once they're shared, Dr. Jewett, feel free to start your presentation when you're ready. Sorry, let me pull it up.
Yeah, so just while you're bringing that up, no, I don't want to join now. I'm going to stay on phone because I'm on the outer coast of Maine, way down east, and there's a snowstorm happening, and I want to make sure that my audio connection continues. So excited to be here. I wanted to let everyone know that I make a huge priority out of mentoring undergraduates and graduates and early career people in NOAA and scientists in labs, and I just want to make myself available. I'll give you my email at the end. So if any of you are thinking about a career in government or science or OA science, please feel free to reach out. You know, that's I take that very seriously, and you know, would appreciate a reach out. I do want to say, because I realize that not everyone may know what NOAA is. We're very into acronyms, and then NOAA is also an acronym. So it's the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We do a lot of different things, and before I started working there, I really didn't understand what those were, and I kind of expect that you probably wouldn't know what they were either. I'm in the research division of NOAA, so I work on oceans research, of course, and I'll tell you more about the program that I lead. But NOAA also we're in charge of the National Weather Service, so every time you look at your phone for a forecast for the weather, you know, that's coming from models that NOAA is funding and running. And, you know, it's a little more complicated than that because I think there's input from other sources as well, but we're basically the weather service. We're the fisheries service, so we regulate and manage our federal fisheries. There are many fisheries off the West Coast around you guys, and we're very much involved in that. We run a big satellite service. About half of our budget goes into satellites, which provide us input both into our ocean research, but also into our weather forecasting. So that's just like a quick overview of NOAA, and it's a really great place to work. Chris used to work there, and I'm sure he'll sing our praises, although he's moved back into academia. I don't think it was back because he was in NOAA for so long. So yeah, I'm in charge of the ocean acidification response in NOAA, and I'm also the chair of the interagency working group, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So next slide. So the way, kind of hard to see, a little small here, but the way we structure our work is originally actually structured our work, and then I'll go into how we're kind of thinking about it now, is that we're a $15.5 million program. We're in charge of making sure we understand kind of how the chemistry of the ocean is changing in all of the US waters, including international waters in some cases. So that's the monitoring piece. We fund a lot of biological response work. So a lot of what Jeana was talking about, understanding, because really, like, so what? Who cares about the chemistry? You know, we can't see it, but what we do care about is everything that's in the ocean, you know, for fisheries reasons, or, you know, for habitat reasons, for coral reasons. So we fund a lot of that work, like a major amount of that work. You know, we're focused on modeling and forecasting out, kind of getting society prepared for how the oceans are changing, and so that they're ready, you know, so that we can sort of adapt our process or economies to how the oceans might change. We do tech development, which a lot of what Chris has been involved in is developing the right sensors for how to do those kinds of measurements. And then we do a lot of other things, education outreach, you know, adaptation, and data. We collect a lot of data and we make sure it's available. So next slide. When you click that, so a new way that we're thinking about our work is all those same things that I talked about, but making sure that we're always answering the question, what are the vulnerabilities both in the ecosystem, and also how does that translate into human vulnerability as ocean acidification unfolds? And that means that a core piece of our work now is looking at the social sciences. So I don't know if there are any social scientists out there who are majoring in social sciences of our group that's listening today, but there is a role, a really strong and growing role for, you know, not just focusing on, okay, how's the ecosystem changes, but how is, like, the whole thing changing, the socio-ecological thing. And I think by doing that, by understanding kind of the human vulnerabilities, we can also target our research better, because we're not ever going to be able to understand everything about how OA is unfolding in the ocean. There's just so many parts of it. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about exposure first. So exposure is kind of how is the chemistry changing and how do we do that? And, you know, I'm not going to touch on a lot because we don't have that much time, but so the next slide is how we do that work. And so we have big major ship efforts that happen every year. We have, you know, big major ship platforms like that one in the upper left-hand corner, you know, where we'll have 30 to 40 scientists on board that are out for like 30 to 40 days. And actually there's going to be one on the West Coast this summer, COVID willing. We had to cancel ones last summer because we just couldn't, you know, we couldn't protect the safety of the crew. And anyway, so we have a cruise happening this summer, and they go on the same transects every time that they go, and they go every 4 years. And then we try and look at the progression of the chemistry changing over time. And so that's one of our major efforts. We also have moorings out, like in the bottom right-hand corner. That was actually, these are devices that Chris developed. He created them, helped develop them, and so I'm sure he's going to tell you more about that. We're also investing in some autonomous platforms like that middle sail drone thing, which actually has no people on it, and just Chris is also helpful with helping develop some of the devices on there, and we can, you know, run it from an iPad and, you know, be collecting the data through satellite uplink. So some really cool things around engineering and you know, using autonomous platforms. So anyway, that's OA observing. So next slide is where we, this is just a graphic showing how variable carbonate chemistry can be. and this is from a paper that came out in 2016 by one of our PMEL, Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, that's our Seattle laboratory scientists. I'm guessing Chris was actually a co-author on this, but this is showing that, you know, if you look to the left under that's the time series that's out in Hawaii, that the variability over the course of the year is actually quite small, but it's actually also what we're measuring now is completely outside what was the case pre-industrial period. And so that's how we know that the pH, the chemistry is changing, you know, over time. But then you look and then you think, oh, well, okay, so that's one story. But if you look on the right-hand side where we have the Gulf of Maine mooring, and then below you have the Gray's Reef, which is off of Georgia, you see a totally different story, which is huge variability over the course of the year. You know, that it actually intersects with what happened in what we can model for what pre-industrial time for that mooring would have been. So it's not as straightforward a case, and determining what's actually happening in coastal systems is kind of a core part of our work, because we more or less know what's happening in the open ocean, because it's less complicated by biology and runoff and people. But when you get into the coastal zone, which is actually where a lot of the rubber hits the road, you know, the story isn't as straightforward. So I just want to make that case and why it's important to have a program that's monitoring this over time. Next slide. So now we'll get into how we're looking at the biology, and I don't have a lot here except next slide. So how do we do the work? We have funded in a number of different NOAA institutions and universities, setting, and I'm sure Jeana probably has one as well, are systems for, we call them, you could call them time machines, actually. So it's a system where you can artificially elevate the CO2 in the water, track the chemistry really closely, put organisms in there, leave them in for whatever period of time, and then measure specific things and try and figure out, okay, does it affect their reproduction? Are they still creating a shell? Is the shell, you know, dissolving over time? Are they, you know, do they grow to, you know, smaller sizes than they did before? So we do this for a lot of different organisms over time. This is actually a system that was built within the Seattle, our Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. So next slide. So that information is rolled up. This is actually a meta-analysis. I don't know if you've heard that term, probably, where you then, so a lot of different studies are being done on impact of OA on different species. This is an example where that information is, and you can see kind of, hopefully you can see along the left-hand side, the different groups of organisms that were analyzed in this paper. And then you create a whole rubric for figuring out, you know, where you put that on the sensitivity scale. Is it a negative impact overall or a positive impact? And you kind of need to keep doing these studies, these meta-analyses, because new papers keep coming out. But the bottom line is that there's actually many more species that we're predicting that OA is going to have negative impacts along the California current, and this is just a California current paper, than positive impacts. But there are some that are going to have positive impacts, so we can't sugarcoat that. I mean, there's going to be winners and losers in OA, just like in other climate change impacts. So next slide. And then human dimensions. This is, next slide. This is where we get into that other part, which is how we intersect with people. And so one of the things that has been an issue is that the OA in the earth, and this is kind of why it really grew as an issue in the US, is it started having an impact on the oyster shellfish industry in the Pacific Northwest. And you guys may have read that story. It's usually like the story you read about OA, if you read about OA. And our approaches to that has been work with the shellfish industry to give them the the device, the ability to be able to monitor carbonate chemistry so that they can change their approach to rearing oysters in order to adapt to the changing conditions. And so that's, you know, not just like doing it because we want to understand what's happening in the ecosystem, but doing it so that we can do this thing that we've been doing, which is rearing oysters for market, right? So next slide. And we're actually expanding that approach out to the rest of the country in some research that we'll be awarding this year. We're also, this is an example where in Chesapeake Bay, we've been funding some work there to forecast out OA conditions just in the next like several days. And so that's actually relevant again, really for the shellfish industry, so that let's say they're about to put out their shellfish to grow out. They tend to hatch them in inside conditions and they want to put them out to grow out. They may look at that forecast and say, oh, like this week isn't going to be good for that in the area where I'm going to be planting these out, so I need to tweak my approach. So that's just one example, and you know, likely used in other ways as well. Next slide. We also developed easy ways to understand, like infographics that are incorporating science into kind of easy ways of understanding how we're the vulnerable, like in this case, Dungeness crabs, huge economic value on the West Coast. And this is to kind of look at, okay, so we have changing carbon dioxide. It's the egg to the megalopy is going to be the more vulnerable period, you know, so sort of a quick, like easy way to digest for the community where they don't have to be looking at graphs and, you know, really complicated information. So we think about that a lot, how you message complicated science. Next slide. And I think I'm going to skip over. This is about economic vulnerability and forecasting that out, and just know that we're also working on that. So next slide. I want to get into some of the national, international aspects of our work. So next slide. So I'm the chair of the U.S. Interagency Working Group. So I'm in charge of the NOAA program and also helping to kind of lead this coordination between our agencies. This working group was set up because of legislation that was passed by Congress. And actually, there's a really like crazy active time now that the administrations have changed. And Biden has a really strong focus on climate change. Congress is really excited because they want to pass all sorts of things related to ocean acidification. So I'm constantly being asked to comment on this and I talked to legislators like every day last week for like 4 hours a day, sort of trying to keep them up to date on what we're doing. And so I'm really excited about the work that we do in the IWG because, you know, we're not just about putting out reports, which is true for a lot of interagency working groups, but also like thinking, okay, we have a cruise this summer. What is EPA doing? What could the National Park Service do along the coast that would coordinate with our cruise? And so that's exciting work. And actually, we're hiring someone as we speak. If you're interested in working for the federal government, I'm hiring a staff person to help me staff the IWG. So anyway, just throwing that out there. Next slide. So on the international scale, NOAA helped, and my program helped found the Global OA Observing Network. And if you click the next slide, so 2013, that was how many countries we had, and this is how many we have now, which is a lot, a big growth. We've really made a huge focus as an international community on expanding access to science, OA science and training in the developing countries. So if you go back just click it back again, you'll see that, you know, very little coverage in Africa and Latin America, and then you go forward and it's just like, you know, we have almost scientists from almost every country, at least along the coast, and many parts of Africa. We have something called the OA Information Exchange, which is something if you just Google, you can join and be part of the conversation about ocean acidification. And many people from many of these countries are actually on our US funded OA information exchange, sharing information, and making sure that we're all sort of moving forward together. And we have a website with a data portal and a mentorship program within that where we're connecting people across countries. So next slide. And I think I'm almost at the end. And so I'm just going to throw these out. I'm almost out of, Kate, am I out of time? I may be out of time. We can go to that. We'll talk about this for 1 second, right?
Yeah, you can talk about this for a little bit.
Run over. I tend to run over. So these are just kind of a laundry list of some other things that I wanted to throw out there. There's a lot of interest, especially now with the change in administration, on net or negative emissions, right? So we know from predictions, obviously, that we need to reduce our emissions. But in order to make sure that we don't surpass the temperature targets, let's say the 2°C temperature target, that's going to really bring on a lot of problems for the planet. There's also a lot of discussion about how do we take CO2 out of the system, out of the atmosphere, and maybe out of the ocean as well. And so there's a really cool, interesting conversation happening through the National Academies of Science that's putting together a report on carbon dioxide removal from marine systems. There's been a focus so far. There's been a report on terrestrial systems, land, like what we can do on land. But since most of the CO2 is actually eventually ends up in the ocean, and much of it that has been sort of produced through fossil fuel emissions has ended up in the ocean, we have to think about also taking out the ocean, because as it gets reduced in the atmosphere, it's actually going to outgas from the ocean anyway. And so it actually makes sense to approach it from both sides. And we are interested, because that's a carbon issue, it's in the ocean, about putting forward the kind of monitoring systems that we put together for ocean acidification, deploy them for this purpose as well, because there's going to be a lot of interest by industry and others. And I don't know, in California, there's a lot of tech startups that may be looking at this topic. I just think it's like a hot topic right now, and I think people might have questions about it. We're also very involved, especially now, again, with the new administration, on UN issues. We just launched the UN Decade for Ocean Science through the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. There's a lot of OA information there, or like work that's going to be happening there, and I think Chris is going to touch on that as well. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know if you guys have talked about that in your classes. There actually is a target within the Goal 14 that's specific to ocean acidification. So we're a lot of our work is sort of structured around that. I talked about reauthorizing OA legislation. That's sort of a hot topic for policy. Renewable energy is the solution. I, for one, both of my kids are working in renewable energy, which gives me a huge amount of satisfaction, and very excited. I obviously imparted some knowledge to them about what's happening with the planet. And one of them's in California, in fact, in San Francisco. And then on the local scale is, again, going back to that work where we're working with under-resourced countries to boost their monitoring and working with State Department on that. And Chris has been really great and leading a lot of that effort. So hopefully he'll touch on that. And then, the big question is how do we resource states and tribes to be doing kind of local stuff? I'm looking out here at the coast of Maine, and they have a lot of questions about what does it mean for their resources for lobster and for scallops. And so we think a lot about kind of from local to national, and because things are different and the oceanography is different in these regions, the approach is going to be different to how they adapt. So I think I'm going to stop there because I probably have talked too long already.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. I think we can now open it up to questions. I will stop sharing my screen. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. Okay, so it looks like Lauren has a question. Her question is, what are some main challenges of communicating the impacts of OA to policymakers, and how do you tackle those challenges?
Well, I think one of the primary ones is that it's not easy. It's chemistry. Like, policymakers. One thing I think we learned early on is that we have now veered away from actually going through chemical equations with policymakers. Scientists, we love those, and we think we need to share all of our knowledge with everybody that we speak to. And one thing that we've realized over time is that sometimes, sharing it in a very, very specific way, like, walking through chemical equation, you're just going to lose people. And you guys can absorb it because you have some science background, but policymakers maybe not. And so we have to step back and say, what do we know? What do we know that they are worried about? And then what can we say about the intersection of OA with what they are worried about? And let's say it's scallops, for instance, like what's going to happen to the scallop industry? And so we can kind of provide information that's relevant for something that they're actually thinking about. So that's, and a whole nother, so that's one thing. And a whole nother thing is making it clear, and this is just something that we've, like a kind of eye of the needle that we've had to thread over time, is making it clear that OA is not climate change. OA is caused by the same cause, climate change. And that has, and it's true, right? I mean, it's both caused by CO2. You can kind of squint your eyes and conflate the two, but OA is caused by CO2, and that actually helps to convey the information in a way that maybe climate change is confusing to them because it's related to weather and it's related to, I don't know, things that are sort of hard to think about on decadal scale. So, and I think we've been successful on that. I think we've gotten traction in communities that we maybe wouldn't have if we tried to say, oh, it's all one thing. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we need to move on. So Nikki wrote in the chat, does the OA program fall under a specific division of NOAA?
Yeah, so we are in the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Division, OAR. And so it's the research division, but we actually do both. We do a lot of oceans work like SeaGrant, if you're familiar with that, that's an OAR. We do ocean exploration. We have big labs like where Chris used to be, but we also do atmospheric work. So we do like the newest weather models are coming out of our division as well. So we kind of have a lot of different things that are happening. Yeah.
Great, well, thank you so much, Libby. I think we can move on to our next speaker. If anyone else has other questions for Libby, you can hold them until the open forum at the end. Okay, so now I will introduce our final speaker, Dr. Chris Sabine. Oh, sorry, got rid of my introduction. Okay, sorry. Dr. Chris Sabine completed his PhD in chemical oceanography at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. He is the former director of NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory and is most notably recognized in the scientific community for pioneering research leading to the discovery of ocean acidification. He is now the Associate Dean for Research at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and conducts research on the impacts of rising CO2 levels on ocean chemistry. Okay, so yeah, you can start your presentation now.
Oh, Chris, oh, by the way, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to block you there. when you were doing the introduction. And so what's the timing? We're not supposed to be done at noon, or?
So we're a little bit over. I think we were aiming for ending in 30 minutes, but it's okay. We can cut into the open forum at the end. Yeah.
Okay, I will try and be fast. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you all today. It's a real honor for me. I guess I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that are available out there for you all to consider. And this comes from my experience as an undergraduate, was that we're basically taught this is how the world works. You know, you read books and have teachers that say this is how things work, and this is what you know, how the research, how the science is. And I remember when I graduated as an undergraduate, I kind of was interested in research, but felt like, gosh, you know, is there anything left to figure out? Because we're all taught this is the way it is. So what's left? What else could there possibly be? And in fact, there are so many questions that still need to be addressed. And in particular, if you think about today's environment where we have rising CO2 and climate change, and basically just looking around you, everything is changing. We can certainly recognize that there's a lot to understand in how those changes are occurring. This is a figure showing atmospheric CO2 for the last 1,000 years. And you can see prior to the Industrial Revolution that atmospheric CO2 was very constant at about 280 parts per million. But that's been changing significantly over the last 200 years since we started burning fossil fuels. And that, as we've all heard in the media and elsewhere, is dramatically impacting our global environment. And there's still a fair bit of research to do on that. But I want to take a step back. You know, Jeana gave a great introductory talk about ocean acidification and some of the details of what's going on in that sort of research. And then Libby followed that up with a discussion of the way that the agencies are trying to fund research to better understand what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. But again, I want to just continue to expand out further and think about, on a global scale, you know, how is climate change and ocean acidification affecting all of us? And we know the World Meteorological Organization has shown us that ocean acidification and climate change is impacting tens of millions of people already in so many different ways, just a few of which are illustrated in this graphic here. So the research that needs to be done, it's not just academic research. You know, it's not just trying to understand some off-the-wall compound or organism, how it works. These are things that affect people's lives and affect our society and affect our ability to make this a better planet for everyone. So the research really is quite critical. And Libby mentioned the United Nations in recognizing that these changes that are happening on our planet are in particular impacting some of the poor and disadvantaged of the world population, has set up these strategic development goals, right? And so there's this idea among economists and among corporate entities that there's this correlation between the GDP, the gross domestic product of countries, which is essentially a measure of the growth rate or the ability of a country to produce things, that correlates very well with fossil fuel use. It also correlates very well with environmental degradation. And so there's kind of this concept or this idea that in order for countries to grow and thrive and survive, there has to be environmental degradation and burning of fossil fuels. But just because that's been the paradigm of the past does not mean that that's the paradigm of the future. And the United Nations has developed these sustainable development goals in an effort to show that we can develop a society, we can develop an economy, a environment that will work in cooperation with nature and can be maintained sustainably. And there are many different aspects of that, ranging from food production and distribution to education to all these different 17 things that have been listed. And as Libby mentioned, number 14 here is the Sustainable Development Goal for the oceans, life below the water it's called. And there are subunits underneath that, one of which is specifically for ocean acidification. So this is the context within which we are all trying to couch our research and our efforts to try and better human society and better our environment all at the same time. Again, under that context, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution that has declared the next decade from 2021 through 2030 the International Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So those of you that are in college now that are thinking of perhaps pursuing a scientific career or getting into a science-related business or any number of things that relate to the environment, if you're interested in the environment, this is the context over the next decade that you can use to understand and couch where the next opportunities might lie as you're thinking of moving into that work sector or the research sector. And as such, we kind of narrowing that down again on the oceans, my specialty is looking at and understanding climate science and the role of the carbon cycle, ocean carbon cycle in the global environment. And so we've recently come together as a community to try and understand what are the major questions that need to be addressed with respect to ocean carbon cycle research over the next decade as part of this International Decade of Ocean Research and Sustainability. And so there are four very primary questions that we've come up with. The first, will the ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2 continue as primarily an abiotic process? So anthropogenic CO2, for those of you that don't know, that's just human-derived CO2. That's CO2 that would not normally be in our environment if it weren't for the mining of fossil fuels and the release of CO2 from human activity. And when we say it's primarily an abiotic process, the oceans currently have about 160 billion metric tons of carbon that have been added to the oceans since around 1800, since the beginning of the industrial era. But that uptake of CO2 has been primarily abiotic. It just is purely related to the fact that CO2 is rising in the atmosphere and it naturally diffuses into the ocean. There's no biological component to that. Now, that's not to say that biology is not important for carbon cycling. It's very important. There's a tremendous amount of biological productivity, both on land and the oceans, that affects carbon cycle. But the ocean uptake of CO2 at the moment seems to be primarily this abiotic process. But will that continue into the future? That's one of the big questions that we're trying to address. Related to that is, what is the changing role of biology in the oceans? As I mentioned, biology is critically important in looking at the overall cycling of carbon in the oceans. But if we think that, for example, productivity in the oceans is primarily regulated by nutrient availability, not carbon availability, then one might infer that biology has not really changed and doesn't play much of a role. But as we've just heard, ocean acidification is one example of where the changing CO2 in the ocean can directly affect the biology and consequently impact that biological ocean carbon cycling. So we don't fully understand that. That's another major question that we need to address over the next decade. What are the exchanges of carbon between land and the ocean and between ocean and ice? And how is that evolving over time? That's a critical question. Libby mentioned that CO2 variability in the open ocean tends to be much smaller than in the coastal regions. But where are most of our human interactions with the ocean? It's in the coastal zone. That's where most of our fishing occurs. That's where most of our pleasure activities in the oceans occur. That's where human modification of the coastlines is having the most dramatic impact on the oceans, is in that coastal zone. So we need to really understand, what is that connection between the land and the open ocean through this coastal zone? And we have the same thing between the ocean and the ice. You know, the Arctic Ocean is is traditionally an ice-covered ocean, but ocean acidification and climate change are happening about 3 times faster in the Arctic than it's happening in the lower latitudes. And as a consequence, the sea ice is retreating rapidly from the Arctic Ocean. How is that connection between climate and ocean acidification and the ice zones in the open ocean changing as this ice is retreating, as glaciers are melting and adding ocean volume to the ocean? And then finally, what is the role of humans in all of this? Libby mentioned that, a strong push on the government research side is understanding not just the basic science of ocean acidification, but how does all of that interact with humans? And what are some of the things that humans are doing that have feedbacks, perhaps unanticipated consequences? Libby mentioned the recent emphasis on carbon dioxide capture and storage in the ocean, right? That seems like a good thing. You take the CO2 out of the atmosphere where it's causing climate to change, but how can we store it in the ocean safely? Is that going to exacerbate ocean acidification? Are there going to be unintended consequences of adding all that extra carbon to the ocean? Doesn't really matter, because we're adding billions of metric tons of carbon to the ocean anyway, just naturally. And so there are all these questions that we need to address. And these are all things that I think all of you could potentially help us to understand. And the interesting way of, I think, of answering these questions or addressing these questions is they tap into and cut across many of the traditional research boundaries that we as scientists typically have followed. I am an ocean chemist. I typically do research on understanding the chemical side of what's happening in the ocean. But the chemistry that I study relates very strongly to the ocean's biology. It also relates to physical circulation. It relates to climate. It relates to human dimensions. So a lot of these questions cut across our traditional boundaries. And again, that's something to think about as you're deciding what sort of a future career you want, that this idea of having a chemist that only understands what's going on at the very minute level in chemistry is kind of evolving into a situation where we need more researchers that are transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary and can look at multiple different aspects of addressing some of these questions. So let me just quickly end here. I said I was going to be fast, but I'm not. You know, how might we've kind of been focusing on ocean acidification today. How does that all relate to what I've just been talking about? And again, Jeana gave a great introduction to what ocean acidification is. We like to say that CO2 is an acid gas, and that's what causes the ocean acidification. Libby showed that there are all these new studies that are coming out that suggest that the predominant impacts of ocean acidification, unfortunately, are on the negative side. They're negatively impacting the ability of our marine ecosystems and organisms to survive and thrive in the new environment. Not all, but many of them are negatively impacted. So, you know, you think, how does that relate back to these four questions? Will ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2 continue as an abiotic process? As I mentioned, ocean acidification is impacting all these species. How is that going to change ocean biology? What is that changing role of biology? Is it going to enhance the ocean uptake of CO2, or is it going to decrease the ocean uptake of CO2? One of the interesting counterintuitive aspects of calcification that Jeana was talking about is that when these corals or oysters or whatever calcify, that actually releases CO2 to the environment. So some have argued that reducing calcification actually could would reduce the amount of CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. Is that the case? But it also affects primary producers. There's coccolithophores, for example, so that if we no longer have coccolithophores, you know, the primary production, the growth of the soft tissues of those organisms is taking up CO2. What's that balance, and how is that going to change the uptake of CO2 in the global climate scenario? The exchanges between land and ocean are also acutely interesting and important for ocean acidification to understand. As I said, this is where the majority of our fisheries happen, is in that coastal zone. That's where the impacts that humans are having on land, releasing nutrients and other compounds into the rivers that flows into the coastal zone, is affecting ocean acidification. The loss of mangroves and seagrasses and things is affecting ocean acidification. And all those examples I just gave are things that humans are doing. So you can see how ocean acidification cuts across all of these different questions and cuts across all the different disciplines. And so I just put this out there as an idea for you all to think about, you know, as you're considering future careers and interests and ways that you can contribute to improving our oceans and our societies, as perhaps some ways that you might want to think about for the future. And I didn't even touch on a lot of things like sea level rise that, but perhaps we can get to that in the questions if you're interested. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to open it up now to all of the speakers. So if anyone has questions for any of the three speakers, feel free to write them in the chat. I actually had a question myself for all three of you. So I recognize that the diversity in this current panel doesn't necessarily represent the diversity in marine conservation and sciences as a whole. I was wondering about your thoughts on diversity in this field and what each of you think academic or government institutions like UCLA or NOAA can do to encourage participation in diversity. I was also wondering if any of you would like to comment on how the public perception of ocean and environmental issues has changed since you were undergraduates. More specifically, how this public perception of diversity and involvement in the ocean conservation field has shifted, and what we can do to increase public awareness of diversity in ocean sciences. So yeah, I would just like to hear any of your thoughts.
Sure, I can perhaps kick it off as the older white male of this panel that is kind of the opposite of what you're talking about. So one of the things that I think both academic and government institutions can do to promote diversity is to proactively reach down into the communities and not just promote STEM education, but also help to promote an understanding of how these global issues, things like ocean acidification, impact every single one of us. You know, we tend to get focused on our local situation and our local issues, but these global problems are looming and they're daunting, and we need basically everyone to help contribute to understanding and studying how to get us out of this situation. So one of the things that I've been doing personally, that Libby has been promoting, that many of us are working on, specifically reaching out to different communities to try and get them involved in understanding and studying some of these global issues. In particular, in my case, you know, the Pacific Islanders are some of the earliest ones to feel the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification. So we've been specifically reaching out to the different Pacific Island nations in an effort to try and encourage them and provide capacity to do research on their own to better understand what's happening in those areas. And it's been, I think, very rewarding and productive.
I'm happy to go unless, Jeana, you want to go. You haven't spoken in a while, so.
I guess I could add from a UCLA perspective, can all of the students who's taken EPSS 15, the Introduction to Oceanography course, either with me or with others, do some sort of one of those little reactions? Raise your hand. Marcus, definitely. Let's see, I'm going to go to gallery real quick so I can see. Okay, we've got a couple of you that have taken the course. So there's a course at UCLA called Introduction to Oceanography. It spans everything from formation of the Earth and why we have water on Earth, all the way through the charismatic megafauna. Good, I'm glad Lauren loved that class. You should all take it if you haven't. It's really fun. If you take it in the summer, you can take it with me. And so the department that class is taught through actually has just announced a diversity, equity, and inclusion and outreach coordinator position. And so, you know, Chris kind of touched on this, you know, we have to reach into the communities, and at the academic level, we need to start getting people into the pipeline. That's going to, you know, it won't maybe impact things in 5 years, but in 20 years, or by the time people get to a postdoc like me, or running divisions in NOAA, or being the dean of research at major research institutions, you know, we need to get those people into the pipeline now. And that position, that EPSS, or it's the Earth, Planetary, and Space Science Department at UCLA, that DEI coordinator position, I think will be integral, at least at the UCLA perspective, for getting people into the ocean sciences.
Yeah, I want to say from the NOAA perspective that we're thinking and talking a lot about this. I guess I would argue that that compared to, 10 or even 20 years ago, that there are a lot more women in ocean science than there were. I don't have statistics to back that up, but I just, by looking at sort of the senior scientists in the field, and many of them are men, I see that there's this kind of push, and I think that there's a majority women even in the graduate studies programs, and that's really exciting to see. I think we haven't developed that racial diversity that we would like to see as well in the ocean sciences. One of the things, I agree with Jeana about the pipeline concept. I do think we have to, like, from a NOAA perspective, be developing way further, like earlier in the pipeline. But I see some changes happening, and one of the things that I personally do is I've been teaching. I try and teach whenever I can, and of course that's on top of a whole big job, but so it's a lot. But I feel like creating those personal connections to people, and then kind of bringing them into NOAA and making that less foreign or whatever. Like, what is federal government work? What is science in the federal government? What is it to do climate change work? What is it to do ocean work? And by demystifying it, I think you can sort of encourage that in ways that didn't exist. And NOAA has a number of connections with different universities, but we've traditionally been stronger in terms of recruiting a diverse workforce in the atmospheric side of what we do. I'm not sure why, but on the oceanographic side, it hasn't really gelled yet. But I see that enough people are thinking about it that it's going to develop. And by the way, for all of you on the call today, we have a lot of internship programs. I mean, there's actually more, like, every year added on, and they are paid ones too for undergraduates, because I think we realize that expecting people not to work for pay is cutting off that opportunity for a lot of people. And so there's a real, work to try and build in some kind of stipend into any internship that we offer. And we're also streamlining the hiring process so that if people, there's actually legislation now that backs us up, that if someone comes in and does a substantial internship, they're then on a potential fast track for a federal position in the federal government. And so that's, like, fast track for getting hired in a government job is good, because it takes a long time otherwise.
I had one more thing about education, since Libby brought it up. So this is directly at all of you students. You deserve to see people like you in your lectures. In my lectures, I try to specifically include people who are typically underrepresented in science, and I'll put their picture on my slide and say this person did something cool, because you all deserve to be seen in science. And you have the right to ask your teacher, your instructors, your lecturers, whatever, are there, I'm from Iowa. Are there any oceanographers from Iowa that you could highlight, or, something like that? Some way that you are represented in the lectures. You deserve to see that. And if you don't ask, probably no one else will.
Great, thank you so much. Those were all really great answers. It's nice to see all the work that's being done to promote diversity. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but, oh, just kidding. Sorry, there is a question just popped up from Charlotte. It's for Chris. She's asking, how has or will your research inform US or global policy?
That's a great question. And that's one of the things that's really changed over the last couple of decades. It used to be that scientists felt like the way that we share our knowledge is through writing scientific papers. And so I just write a scientific paper, And then it's up to you to go and read it and understand it and do something about it. What we're realizing is, okay, that doesn't really work, right? I mean, that may help to inform our colleagues and our other scientists that are interested in that topic. But we really do have to be more proactive about sharing our work with the general community and with policymakers. You know, Libby mentioned that she spends a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking directly with policymakers. Many of us do that same work. So it's establishing relationships with the policymakers, but also, you know, just talking to the community. And that's something that you all can do too. If you're passionate about a topic, you know, go out and share it with your friends and your cohorts and get people riled up and tell them to write their congresspeople. And it really, it really is important that policymakers hear from their constituents, and that's what they're going to mostly react to. We also have, you know, direct connections. So I was a coordinating lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I was writing a chapter on the carbon cycle and that feeds directly into the governments and the policymakers from 186 different countries. Connecting with the United Nations programs, like I've talked about in my talk, is another way to kind of fast track some of the work that you're doing, that we're all doing, to get it to the policymakers. But, you know, I think an underappreciated strength really is in making your voice heard in the community and getting a group of your peers to speak directly to policymakers.
Well, and there's a whole science really to communicating science. And you can go into that. Like you don't even have to become a full-scale scientist to be a communicator of science. And I think that, as Chris has pointed out, has become hugely, recognized as hugely important. Because not only is it important to get the word out on what you're finding out, but for the future of the funding of your work, you know, policymakers need to understand the importance of the work that we're doing. And just like, you know, there's a science to it, and it's engaging and them understanding who's a person and, you know, kind of getting at the message, but it might just, you know, anyway, I encourage you to look more into that and hopefully take courses in it if you end up in graduate school or even undergraduate. I think that's offered more and more.
If I can throw out one more UCLA-centric thing, I'm back in gallery mode so I can see all of you. How many of you have volunteered with the Explore Your Universe annual outreach event at UCLA? Can you put a little reaction thing? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. Those of you that I know, and I know several of you, you need to start volunteering with that. So both Chris and Libby mentioned talking to politicians and writing your politicians or going to their office, not now, once everybody's vaccinated. But you know, that can be scary because they're like super grown up and everything. But at Explore Your Universe, you're kind of explaining to 3- and 4-year-olds how sand is made. And they don't care that much if you get it that wrong because they get to play with sand. And so, like, you know, start getting outreach experience that way.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're technically at the end of our event, but there are a few more questions. So if you guys are free for a few more minutes, if not, feel free to head out. There was a question from Nikki, and she's asking everybody, what is the most rewarding part of your work?
This.
That's a toughie. I mean, I guess feeling like you have some role in dealing with a really important issue. you know, and trying to, in my case, kind of direct research in a way that's actually going to be useful for society, and getting good feedback from people. And actually, frankly, working with all of you, like working with young people and mentoring them in science and career paths. And I had like a really funky career path, so, you know, can share that anytime. But yeah, no, I think, yeah, the mentorship and just being part of something bigger that's really positive.
So I guess I'd say two things. One, I love doing outreach to communities that are feeling frustrated or left out and want to contribute but don't know how. And so I'll go to Fiji or somewhere and do a training on how to do ocean acidification research, and to just see these researchers that really want to do something to understand their environment get it, you know, to understand, oh, okay, this is what I can do to, you know, better understand what's going on the reefs out off my coast. I think I find that very rewarding. The second one is something actually that happened to me recently. And so I have a niece that's about the age of all of you, goes to school in California, you know, a new college student, nothing to do with science, nothing to do with oceanography. But I get this text message from her the other day saying, one of my friends just figured out that you're my uncle, and she says you're a rock star. And so I was like, wow, okay. And the funny thing was my niece was like, I had no idea that you actually knew what you were talking about. And so I just, you know, the way it kind of comes around, you know, I do a lot of these type events and I talk to a lot of people, and I guess you just never know who you're touching. And so when one of those kind of weird little circles comes back and I get some feedback of, you know, oh yeah, I heard you talk at some point, you really made a difference. That's just very fulfilling for me.
Yeah, these outreach events are, I think, part of the most fulfilling part for me. If you can inspire the next group of scientists, because like I'm reaching the point in my career where I think things aren't possible anymore because I've been, you know, ingrained into how to do science and when to know to stop doing the experiments because I keep getting the same wrong, bad results. But you all are young and you don't know what's impossible yet, and getting to see you kind of push the bar, to me, that's really cool.
Great, thank you so much. I actually had another question. I think that a lot of us in this talk are interested in pursuing careers in science or in the conservation field. I was just wondering if any of you have any advice for us, maybe advice that helped you out when you guys were pursuing these careers, or maybe things that you came across that you wish you had learned about earlier, that type of stuff.
Shall I go first? Yeah, I mean, the first advice I always give is if you think you're going to do a graduate degree, don't do it right away. I think it's good to take a break. You've been working hard as an undergrad, you know, go work, you know, as a technician in a lab if you think that's what you want to do, and just kind of get your feet wet and take, you know, like have your nights free and your weekends free just for a while. You know, you can always apply to graduate school and that can start next year. And you never know whether that's going to like change your mind about what you want to do or the field you want to work in or the advisor that you want to work with. So that's one thing. And, you know, you can even not work in a lab. You could work on Capitol Hill, or you could work for your state government, or, you know, try out the kind of policy side too. So, and there are obviously a lot of, you know, positions in non-governmental organizations that are working on marine conservation. I do find that in NOAA, and I don't know if Chris would correct me, but many people in NOAA have masters or PhDs. A lot, you know, even if we're working on budgets, you know, most of us have a probably unrelated background in science. But I will also say my boss, who's pretty high in the food chain, has just an undergraduate degree. Not just, but has an undergraduate degree. So, you know, there are jobs in NOAA for people without advanced degrees. So I love it at NOAA. I think there's sort of incredible opportunities and, you know, lots of what am I trying to say? Intellectual stimulation and, you know, great people to work with. And, you know, it's been really supportive during COVID, shockingly supportive, which has been great. So, and I would look definitely at internships. I mentioned that before. And one other thing to note, if you go to graduate school and you think you might want to be involved with NOAA, there's something called the Knaus Sea Grant Fellowships, which are, you have to apply before you graduate from the graduate program, but they're an opportunity to come and live in, well, right now they aren't living there, but in DC for the year and work for NOAA or work for On the Hill or work for State Department on marine issues. So there are a lot of opportunities. I'd be happy to share that with me if you guys email me.
Go ahead, Jeana. Okay. Well, so I guess my first thought on that is don't feel boxed in by tradition, right? So when I was finishing undergraduate, basically the idea was you go and you get your PhD, you become a professor, and you teach and do research, and that's the path. That's the career path that one takes if you're interested in doing research. And I actually deviated from that a bit, because so a kind of a parallel path is you get your PhD, you go work in a government lab and do research, and that way you don't teach. But I think today there are so many amazing and diverse opportunities that just really take a look at all the, you know, Libby mentioned the NGOs, you know, there's all these philanthropic organizations, there's environmental companies, there's, you know, regular corporations that are hiring sustainability officers and environmental consultants to help them improve their business models. There are just so many different ways that you can contribute to helping the environment and helping the world that, you know, are not limited to just the traditional research path. I'm on the traditional research path. I'm not saying anything bad about that it works, but if you don't feel that that's for you, you know, or you're just not sure that's the right way to go, there are so many other ways to take that enthusiasm, that interest that you've got in helping the environment and channel it through whatever else, you know, does fit with your personality and your style. And I'd say just don't give up on that dream just because you don't think you're ready to follow that path of going through a whole degree program and then becoming a professor and having to teach and do research in the traditional manner. There are many ways to contribute.
To add on to the many ways to contribute, I have to, of course, make a plug for things like the Peace Corps and Teach for America and AmeriCorps. One thing I learned as a Peace Corps volunteer is that, we get taught in books Western methods to do things like, for example, conservation, and they're not always the best way to do things in non-industrialized nations. And so, learning that there are other ways to think about conservation and science while contributing, I think is really important as you move your career forward, and also as part of the deviating path to your eventual career. And then, since I like to ask you all a bunch of questions and I have you in gallery view, how many of you are getting research right now as undergrads? Getting research experience in the lab? Charlotte, I know. Okay, good. Let's scroll through. Okay, some of you. If you want to have a career in conservation, I very strongly recommend that you get some research experience, even if it's not what you think you want your end goal to be. So I'm going to pick on Jessie because I like to pick on students that work with me. Jessie has a conservation focus for what she wants to do, after her undergraduate career. But she's been working with me on microgeochemistry of fish otoliths. Has nothing to do with chemistry or with conservation, but she's getting research experience that will look good on her resume. She's learning skills, transferable skills that will help her as she moves forward in her career. Sorry, my kids are giggling maniacally at a movie. But so like, even if you get research experience in a lab that studies ocean chemistry using computer models, you will gain a lot of skills that would help you in some, squishy biology type conservation job later on. So the next time I see all of you, I want lots of thumbs up when I ask if you're getting research experience in labs.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I think that we're a little bit over time, and so I think we should wrap it up. I'd like to thank again everyone for joining us, especially speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and work with us. I have a few announcements. Our next general meeting for ORCA it's not this Friday, but it will be the following Friday during week 7. And then our second movie night will be week 8, the Friday after the general meeting. And during the movie night, we are planning to watch Perfect Planet. So yeah, unless anyone has any further questions or comments, I think that we can end the panel. Thank you again to the speakers. This has been super amazing.
Kate, you have to make sure you guys watch My Octopus Teacher. Have you watched that? Oh
yeah.